Hello and welcome to the Janome channel. My name is SewRena, your Janome maker who loves retro fashion. In today's video, I'll be using my Janome Skyline S9 to make my very first swimsuit, but also I'll be using a reproduction vintage pattern to create it using modern materials, as well as a modern machine that I think is more than capable of sewing some finicky stretch fabric. So if you're interested in seeing me sew up this suit, go ahead and like and subscribe, and let's get into it. The pattern I'm using today is Advanced 5099. It is a Lady Marlowe reproduction pattern, which you can find online. Today I'll be focusing just on the swimsuit since I've never sewn with knits. I want to make sure that I have a swimsuit before I get ahead of myself and start making the jacket or beach coat. Here is the pattern diagram as well as the fabric requirement and the sizing. This is a one-piece swimsuit that appears to be a two-piece. Now let's talk about the fabric. I'm using this heavy knit material. It's not a swimsuit knit because vintage swimsuits were not super thin. They were a lot thicker with less stretch. Next, I'm using a swimsuit lining. This is pretty basic. Now let's talk about the tools that will hopefully make this process go by smoothly. I'm using some stretch needles as well as this Elo Flex Coats & Clark stretchable thread. Should this suit turn out well, I want it to last a really long time. So now it's time to start cutting out my pattern pieces. I'm starting out with the bottoms because they're pretty straightforward. I'm cutting them out with some scissors and I am doubling the fabric. If you're using traditional or more modern swimsuit fabric that's a lot more slippery, I would cut them out one at a time. But for this, the fabric didn't move very much, so I was able to cut them double, and then I'm adding my darts with some chalk. I pinned all my pieces before heading over to the sewing machine. I want to say before I started this process, I used some scrap fabric to test out the stitches that I wanted to use for this project, and most of the stitches that I use are the stretch stitch. I think the stretch stitch paired with the stretchable thread did a really good job. It looked good when pulled on the outside, and it also looked really nice on the inside. Press your seams as you would on any other project, especially this one since you're going to be using the seam allowances to make the casing for the ruching on the side of the swimsuit. Next, I pin the center seams and take it back over to the machine to sew. I am not very fond of sewing knits, plus it's not necessary for the wardrobe that I've created for myself since knits weren't common around the eras that I choose to dress. At the time that I usually dress, knits were usually hand knitted and weren't readily available in fabric stores, so it wasn't something that the machines at the time necessarily had to sew. What was available wasn't quite as stretchy as what we have today, plus garments in general were just more structured, including swimsuits and bathing suits that usually had boning or some sort of undergarment sewn into it to help with the shapewear and the silhouettes of the time. Because of this, I am so inexperienced with sewing with stretch materials, even though I've been sewing for many years. I knew that when I became a Janome maker, one of the projects that I absolutely had to make was a swimsuit because I had the ability to use all of the wonderful stretch stitches available on the machine, including the 3-stitch zigzag, which I didn't actually use for this project, but I did test it out. The front and the back of the bottoms are now complete, so it's time to bring them together, right sides together, and sew them up the side seams to make them one. Now I start sewing down the seam allowance to make a casing to draw up the side seams. You want to sew this down at 1/4 inch. Because of the stretchable thread, you have the option to sew this with a standard straight stitch, or you can do the stretch stitch like I've been using to construct the garment. At this point, I'm impressed with how well this project is going. I've never gotten this far on my older antique and vintage machines, so this was very exciting. Now I'm using a safety pin and some cording to thread the cord through the channels that we made previously. I did leave the crotch seam open so that way I could have more access to sewing or top stitching those channels down and also putting the cording through. So once I've gathered that up, it's time to sew down the crotch seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance like everything else. The lining is made exactly like the shorts except for the ruching on the side, so I did that off camera And now I'm preparing to basically hem or put the two pieces together. I'm using a hem tape called Light Easy Seam. You can press this material as you've seen earlier in the video. However, you can't press it hot enough to where when you press the seam allowance down, it stays. So for a little bit added security, I went ahead and used this easy seam to kind of fold over the 1/2 inch seam allowance on both the outer swimsuit as well as the lining. So when it comes time to top stitch the pieces together, they don't move. This acts like a double stick tape. It's both sticky already and you just add a little bit of pressure to hold it down, and then for some added security you take it over to the ironing board and press with steam. I do the same thing with the lining material, and then I take it over the sewing machine and then do a top stitch. You could get away with hand basting down the seam allowance on both sides, but I didn't really want to push my luck with this. I really wanted to get this as close to perfect on the first try as possible. So I pulled out all the stops and bought all the tools to make this thing go by smoothly. I also use the easy seam to sew down the zipper, and I love it so much better than using pins. I will definitely be using this again in the future. Now it's time to put the shorts down for a while and start working on the bodice. I'm sewing down the center front of both the facing and the outer swimsuit. This is not lined with swimsuit fabric, and I think it's a really good idea because using the original fabric as a facing really gives it that nice structure. And I was going to make my own cups to put inside of it, but I felt like with the thicker fabric as the backing, it wasn't necessary. Put the bra tops right side together, making sure that you don't sew over the center seam because that's going to be the opening for the ties later. So you're essentially making another casing. You also want to leave it open at the bottom of the bra top as well as the sides, so that way you can turn it right side out later. So you're going to stop where that white pin is and then pick back up where the yellow pin is, leaving the seam allowance open because you're going to be using the seam allowance for the casing like we did with the side seams of the bottoms. Once the top is right sides together, then sew down the center seam, and then you're going to want to stitch 3/8 from the center on both sides, creating the casing for the neck strap. Sewing down the center seam was pretty easy because you could just follow the guide of the seam, but for the right and the left of the casing, it was a little bit more difficult, so I decided to mark the stitching line with chalk, and thanks to the clear feet on the Janome, I was able to see my markings and it was easy breezy. I was really excited about this project because, again, I've never gotten this far, so it was definitely motivation to keep going, and I did get most of this project done in the same day. I think the only thing that delayed this project was I didn't have a zipper, so that's how much I enjoyed sewing this on the Janome because I just could not have done it without it, unless, of course, I had one of Janome's sergers. On to what the pattern calls a belt. I did interface it, leaving the seam allowance open so that way I could still stretch the material. I sew it right sides together and then I top stitch with a straight stitch using my standard thread, but still using the stretch needle. Once the belt, waistband, or midriff is done, it's time to attach it to the bra, and this is only partially attached, so that way it still looks like a two-piece in the front, but then you can see that it's a one-piece in the back. The reason I use the standard thread for the belt or the midriff is because when top stitching a non-stretch area, I felt like it was easier for the machine as well as my patients to use a non-stretch thread because that thread loved to break. However annoying working with this thread may be, it was definitely worth it because the durability and the stretch that I get on the side seams makes it to where I do feel like this swimsuit will last. Once the top and the bottom have been joined, it's time to do some embroidery. One of the features that I absolutely adore about the sewing machine is the ability to really personalize this and make it look like a true vintage piece by adding my signature. And this is the final look of the suit. I am so happy with how it turned out. It is almost a perfect fit, but for the legs being a bit too wide on me, but I think this is definitely a win for someone who does not sew with knits and has never made a swimsuit before. All I have to do is a couple tweaking to the pattern and I think I'll be ready to go for this summer. If you have not already, please consider liking and subscribing to the Janome channel. Leave me a little comment below. I'd love to see what you guys think of the sewing process, the machine, as well as the swimsuit itself. I really love the design. I love that it's a one piece, so I don't have to keep up with two separate pieces, but it looks like a two piece in the front. Also, the midriff is my favorite design feature from the time period. Check out Janome's Instagram to see the variety of talented makers that they have on the team. Until next time, I'll see you in the next one.